So today I wanted to talk about The Plague by Albert Camus and specifically how it relates to my experience with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so as a result, this won't exactly be a review or a video essay, but rather it will be a general selection of reflections, which rhymes. If you're familiar with Camus, it's probably because of The Stranger, which came out in 1942. The Cure did a song for it, and apparently it's a book that they read in school sometimes, but I didn't have that experience. Whenever I was in school, we had to read like Tangerine and Of Mice and Men and all these books that I hated. But The Stranger is really cool. I like it a lot. That book really feels to me like an anti-Crime and Punishment in a lot of ways, and I think it's just great. And so The Plague is a good bit different than The Stranger in a lot of ways. As opposed to just being focused on a single man like The Stranger, The Plague is focused on a town, Oran. Oran was a town that belonged to French Algeria. At this point, it's just in Algeria, but it's a port town. In the early chapters, it's described as being a quaint little place, essentially. And so The Plague is a book about what happens whenever the Black Plague comes out in that town and spreads. In essence, it's a book about a pandemic. And I didn't find out about this until after I finished reading the book, but apparently the city in real life had some plague outbreaks. But the outbreaks in real life were never on the same scale as they were in this book. In the book, the plague spreads like crazy, the city has to be shut down and quarantined, and the book is about life during this period of roughly a year, give or take, I think, when the plague is active. I hope I'm saying his name right, but Dr. Roux is the primary character, the protagonist of the novel, and being a doctor, he is exposed to pretty much every single part of the plague. And really, this novel is about how people cope with the plague, it's how they make sense of life now that there's this invisible disease that's going around. And I don't have to tell you this unless you're watching this video in like 20 or 25 years time and you weren't alive during the pandemic, but life during a pandemic looks very different than it does in, normal living situations. In the book, people are called to join sanitation squads. If someone is found to have the plague, then they are quarantined and their family is quarantined. People who are quarantined in the city miss their loved ones. And all in all, this book reminds me a lot of A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. I always want to say Willem Dafoe, but that's not him. But yeah, Journal of the Plague Year I think came out in like the 17th century, and it's about the Black Plague. And so those two books feel very similar. They cover a lot of the same topics. They just talk about people's reactions to the existence of a pandemic. And so as I was reading it recently in a post-COVID world, basically I had all these thoughts about it, basically, because there are a lot of things that are similar. They play out similarly in the book to how they did in the real world during the COVID-19 pandemic. But then there are other things in this book that remind me that this is indeed a work of fiction. So for instance, in the book, people work together. In the book, people are very supportive, and there's no doubt as to whether or not the plague exists, and no one tells you to inject cleaning fluid into your veins. And so this was a book that caused me to reflect a lot on my pandemic experience. And if we were any closer to the pandemic, I wouldn't be recording this video, but depending on how you count it, somewhere between 2 to 4 years have passed since COVID has kind of been over. But regardless, I feel like the pandemic, most people were kind of over it by mid-2022 roughly, maybe even before that, depending on your situation and your location and so on. But I mean, at least for me, I was back going to concerts during the summer of 2021. And so what I'm trying to say with that basically is it's been a while. We're not actively in a pandemic, but there's this idea presented at the end of the book that really kind of resonated with me. And so as I've said, this book is about a city dealing with a Black Plague outbreak. In the book, it's only this one specific city that has the plague. It's not anywhere else in the world. And so basically in the city, they keep it locked down while there are still people dying from the plague. But then as the cases drop off and as more and more people recover, the city finally, at the end of the book, opens up and people are allowed to reunite with their loved ones who are on the outside of the city. So there's a big scene at the end of the novel where basically it shows all these people reuniting, and it discusses all the people who died during the plague. And so the last bit of the book, the final paragraph, talks about the doctor I mentioned, the main character, watching these crowds. He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves. In that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightening of men, it roused up its rats again and sent them forth to die in a happy city. And so basically the idea behind that passage is it's just showing that even though the plague has been conquered, so to speak, it never truly dies. Even though by the end of the book the pandemic is over, the outbreak is over, even though people are reuniting and they're really happy to see their loved ones, and even though life seems to be going back to normal, outbreaks can strike at any moment. In essence, it can come back. And I think that passage is really important for the book because of the fact that it ends the book on a bittersweet note. Again, life is going back to normal, but at the same time, there's always the chance. There's always the chance that the plague could strike again and that the city could be shut down again. There's always the chance that there could be another pandemic. And it's that feeling right there, the feeling that there could be another pandemic, that really resonated with me. At this point, I think life's pretty normal. Again, depending on how you count it, it's been at least a couple years since the COVID-19 pandemic ended. And so I think as a result, most things are kind of back to being the way they were. For better or for worse, things are mostly back to normal. But at the same time, in spite of all this, in spite of the fact that life is pretty normal and you don't have to wear a mask whenever you go places, in spite of the fact that you don't have to show off COVID vaccine cards and no one really talks about it anymore, in spite of the fact that it has been roughly 5 years since the start of the COVID-19 outbreak, in spite of all these things, there's still this deeply rooted internal fear within me that this is all a facade. In other words, there's just that feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop. There's this feeling of disbelief and doubt as to our current situation. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that there's still a part of me that fears that some other kind of outbreak will happen. There's still a part of me that feels like because a pandemic has happened once, it can happen again. And even though COVID-19 wasn't exactly the Black Plague, even though most people who got it recovered from it, including me, in spite of that, there's still a feeling with me that there's some kind of oncoming plague or pandemic and it will be 10 times worse than COVID. And this isn't me having a Nostradamus moment or whatever. I'm not making predictions or prophecies or whatever. I'm just trying to address this feeling that's within me. Like I said, there's still that part of me that worries that there's more to come. Even though, again, depending on how you count it, you've probably been living a normal life for 1,000+ days. In spite of that, there's still that fear of returning to the pandemic world. I'm very introverted just by nature, and so as a result, I don't think I was hurt by not being able to interact with as many people as I previously had. I missed going to concerts and I missed being able to hang out with my friends and go and do things, but at the same time, it could have been worse for me. But really, I know it was a bad time. I know it was a horrible time for a lot of people. And anytime I talk to people now about it, everyone, even though it's been, like I said, 5 years since the start of the pandemic, everyone I talk to still feels like there was a time jump. In essence, I don't think most people made any memories during that period, and so it's hard to believe that it's 2025. For a lot of people I know, they feel like it should still be 2022 or something. And so things are just weird, and I think we have a weird relationship to viruses now and pandemic stories. If you haven't read the book, it's a good book. I would recommend The Plague, especially if you're already a fan of Camus, or if you just want to read a French novel written in the 1940s, I say go for it. But the ending to the book that I read earlier just felt so special to me because it perfectly captured the way that I feel. There's still that fear in me that there will be some sort of outbreak or pandemic and that we'll be locked away and lose time. There's still that fear in me that we will experience a pandemic again and that things will be 10 times as worse as they were. And there's still that part of me that anytime I make decisions, I wonder about how I will be affected by this decision if a pandemic arises. There's a paper that was written by Jeremy Jeffrey Cohen, I think, and basically it's a paper about monsters and horror. And he makes an argument that basically in order to be a successful monster, whatever monster, Frankenstein, Dracula, etc., it has to follow some sort of pattern, basically. In order to be effective, it has to have certain characteristics, and one of those characteristics, in order to be a lasting horror icon, the monster has to escape. And since the monster has escaped, that means it's out there and that it can return at any moment. And that reminds me of the plague in this book. Basically, the plague escapes. And the plague can't die, it's not some kind of singular villain. But at the same time, it appears that the plague has been defeated in the book. But still, we as readers know, and the doctor knows, that plague can return at any moment. And that's what makes monsters effective, and that's what makes the plague, or in this case, as I'm talking about my own personal experience, that's what makes the concept of a pandemic so scary. Whenever the plague shows up in the book, just as the COVID-19 pandemic happened in the real world, it seemed to come out of nowhere. And all these things, just as they appeared from nowhere, they go and venture forth into nowhere. COVID-19 is basically here. It's just another virus now. I've gotten sick with it, and I'm sure many of you have gotten sick with it. And at the end of the day, as I'm saying, it's not as bad as the Black Plague, which wiped out half or 2/3 of Europe or whatever the heck. And so it's not COVID specifically that I'm scared of, but there's just that anxiety that things will change, that things will go back to being not great. I think that even though we've kind of reached the point of normal after the pandemic, I feel like there are still a lot of things that are messed up as a result of it. And you can't stay and lick your wounds forever, and it doesn't do any good to do that. And so as a result, I feel like there are a lot of things that have been swept under the rug. But at the same time, there's still that fear. There's still that fear and anxiety within me that some kind of pandemic will come within my lifetime and your lifetime. Basically, there's just that fear in me that things will return to the way they were 5 years ago. But really, at the end of the day, and I know this, and I'm sure you know this, it does no good to sit there and worry and be anxious. It does us no good to worry about something that might happen. And so as a result, it's better to just focus your time and energy and effort and attention on other things that benefit you. But at the same time, there's still that fear. And I think The Plague is a book that helped me to identify that fear. And so really, I would be interested in hearing if I'm crazy, and I'm the only one worrying about a potential future pandemic, but I would be willing to bet anything that I'm not. I would be willing to bet anything that I'm not alone in worrying about this. So thank you for watching. In case it's not clear, I think that you just have to move on with your life in spite of any future challenges that may arise. This book's good. I would recommend it. And that's what I got. So thank you for watching. Have a nice night and goodbye.